She looks like she came here to pick up trash, Mason's aunt hissed, her voice cutting through the festive air of Brighton University's library, opening the Hall family's scorn, targeting Clara Nguyen, Mason's Asian adoptive mother, who stood quietly in her modest dress. Their cruel whispers set the stage for a tale of triumph that would flip their prejudice upside down. What hidden heroism would silence their mockery? Could Clara's quiet strength outshine their venom? Stay with us to uncover a story that redefines love and courage. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe now to catch our latest videos and drop a comment to share where you're watching from. Will the Hall's arrogance crumble? Will Mason's pride in his mother shine through? Join us to witness a truth that proves heroes don't need titles, only heart. Keep watching. The sun hung low over Brighton University, painting the campus in hues of amber and gold as the new library's grand opening buzzed with anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut flowers and polished wood, and the crowd, dressed in crisp suits and elegant dresses, mingled under chandeliers that glittered like captured stars. It was a day of triumph. A celebration of knowledge and legacy where Mason Hall, a brilliant young scholar, stood on the cusp of being honored for his groundbreaking work in social sciences. But beneath the clinking glasses and polite laughter, a sharper sound cut through. Whispers, cruel and deliberate, aimed at a woman who stood apart. "Looks like she came here to pick up trash," Mason's aunt, Deborah Hall, muttered, her lips barely moving as she clutched a flute of champagne. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed on Clara Nguyen, Mason's adoptive mother, who stood quietly at the back of the hall. Clara, a 42-year-old Asian woman, wore a simple navy dress, its hem slightly frayed from years of wear. Her hair was pulled back neatly and her posture was composed, but her presence seemed to unsettle the Halls, who stood like a tableau of privilege near the front. Deborah's sister, Mason's grandmother, Judith, leaned in, her pearl necklace catching the light. "I can't believe he brought her to this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried just far enough to sting. Clara heard it. She always did. Her dark eyes flickered briefly toward the Halls, but her face betrayed no hurt, no anger, only a quiet resilience that seemed to anchor her against the storm of their disdain. She adjusted the thin silver bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Mason when he was 12, and let her gaze drift to the stage where banners proclaimed the library's opening. This wasn't her world with its marble floors and tailored suits, but she was here for Mason. Always for Mason. Mason, tall and sharp in a charcoal suit, weaved through the crowd. His diploma, still warm from the morning ceremony, was tucked under his arm. His smile was bright, his eyes alight with pride, but as he approached Clara, he caught the tail end of his aunt's words. His jaw tightened and his steps slowed, the joy of the day souring in his chest. He reached Clara's side, his hand finding hers in an instinctive gesture of solidarity. "You made it," he said softly, his voice warm but laced with an edge of defiance. "You're always here for me." Clara's smile was small but radiant, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Wouldn't miss it, Mason," she replied, her voice steady though her fingers tightened briefly around his. She stood a little straighter, her steps careful, betraying a slight limp, a quiet echo of the surgery she never spoke of. Her presence was a quiet rebuke to the Hall family's cruelty. Mason glanced toward his family, their pressed collars and polished shoes, a stark contrast to Clara's understated grace. He wanted to shout, to call out their hypocrisy, but Clara's calm held him back. She had taught him that strength wasn't in the loudest voice, but in the one that endured. The library's atrium was a marvel of modern design, with towering glass walls and shelves that stretched toward the ceiling like promises of knowledge. Guests milled about, their conversations a low hum of academia and ambition. Professors shook hands with donors, students posed for photos, and the halls held court near a display of rare manuscripts, their laughter as crisp as their linen. But their eyes kept darting to Clara, who stood alone now as Mason greeted a mentor. The hem of her navy dress brushed against scuffed shoes, the same pair she wore to every important event, quietly polished to hide the wear. Deborah leaned toward her cousin, a man with a slicked-back haircut and a Rolex that gleamed under the lights. She was the help. "You know," she said, loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "Just the cleaner who somehow ended up raising him. Can you imagine?" The words landed like a slap, and a few guests shifted uncomfortably, their smiles faltering. Clara, standing by a table of hors d'oeuvres, didn't flinch. She shifted her weight slightly, masking the discomfort in her hip, a familiar ache she carried like a secret. She picked up a glass of water, her movements deliberate, and took a sip, her eyes scanning the room as if the insults were nothing more than background noise. But Mason, returning from his conversation, caught the remark. His face flushed, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. He took a step toward his aunt, but Clara's hand grazed his arm, a gentle anchor pulling him back. "Let it be," she murmured, her voice low but firm. There was a faint trace of an accent still coloring her words, a soft reminder of where she came from, of what she had overcome. "Today's about you." Mason's chest heaved, his anger a living thing clawing to break free. He saw it in the way her fingers fidgeted with her bracelet, the way her smile tightened when Deborah's voice carried over the crowd. Yet Clara stood tall, though her weight shifted subtly from foot to foot, favoring her right leg, a small concession to an old ache she never mentioned. Her presence was a quiet defiance. She didn't belong to their world of wealth and status, but she belonged to Mason, and that was enough. As the president continued hinting at a special announcement to come, Mason felt a stir of anticipation. Something in the air shifted, a promise of revelation that made his heart race. The hall's whispers had drawn a line, but Mason sensed that line was about to be crossed in a way no one expected. For now he stood by Clara, their hands clasped, ready to face whatever came next. The glow of the chandeliers in Brighton University's library atrium softened as the evening deepened, casting a warm sheen over the crowd. Mason Hall stood beside Clara and Gwyn, his adoptive mother, their hands still linked from the sting of the hall's earlier barbs. The air hummed with anticipation for the president's upcoming announcement. But for Mason, the moment was a pause, a breath to anchor himself in the woman who had shaped his world. Clara's navy dress caught the light, its simplicity a stark contrast to the opulence around them. Yet her presence burned brighter than the polished marble or the hall's smug pearls. As the crowd's murmurs faded, Mason's mind slipped into memory, pulling him back to the years that had forged their bond, a story written in quiet sacrifices and unspoken love. Clara's face, serene yet resolute, seemed to hold 1,000 stories. Fine lines framed her mouth, lines not just of age but of years spent enduring, persevering, and smiling through hardship. Mason saw her now, not as the woman the halls mocked, but as the lighthouse she'd always been. His thoughts drifted to when he was 6, a trembling boy left hollow by his mother's death. The halls, with their wealth and cold formality, had offered little beyond a roof. It was Clara, then just the family's cleaner, who saw the ache in his eyes. She didn't have to stay late to read him bedtime stories or slip him extra cookies from her own meager lunch. No one asked her to, but she did, because to her, a child's loneliness was a call she couldn't ignore. Mason remembered the first time she drove him to school in her battered sedan, its engine coughing like it was catching a cold. The other kids, with their shiny backpacks and parents in sleek cars, snickered as he climbed out. "Is that your maid?" one had jeered, pointing at Clara's worn apron peeking from her bag. Mason had ducked his head, cheeks burning, but Clara just smiled, a smile that carried the soft burr of an accent she never quite shed. Handing him a brown bag lunch with a note tucked inside. "You're enough, Mason, always." He hadn't understood then, but that note in her careful handwriting became a talisman he carried through every doubt. Back in the atrium, Clara's hand squeezed his, pulling him from the memory. She was watching the stage, her expression calm but alert, as if she sensed the shift in the room's energy. Mason's heart ached with gratitude. He thought of the nights she'd sat with him at their rickety kitchen table, helping him puzzle through math homework when he was 12. His first test failure had crushed him, the red F glaring like a wound. The halls had dismissed it, saying he'd never match their legacy. But Clara stayed up past midnight, her fingers tracing equations on scrap paper, her voice steady. "You don't fail when you fall, Mason. You fail when you don't get up." By dawn, he'd grasped fractions. And more than that, he'd learned resilience. The crowd's chatter rose as a professor passed by, nodding politely at Mason but barely glancing at Clara. Mason's jaw tightened, the hall's earlier words, "She's just the help," echoing in his mind. He wanted to shout that Clara was more than they'd ever be, but her quiet strength held him back. She taught him that love didn't need to scream. It showed up day after day in actions louder than words, like the time she'd sewn his high school graduation suit, her fingers pricking with each stitch because the halls refused to buy him one. "They don't see you yet," she'd said, threading the needle, "but they will." Mason's gaze drifted to his grandmother, Judith, standing with Deborah near a display of rare books. Their laughter was sharp, their eyes flicking toward Clara with practiced disdain. He remembered asking Clara once when he was 15 why she never claimed him as her son in front of them. "Why let them define us?" she'd replied, her smile soft but unyielding. "Love doesn't need their papers, Mason. It's in every breakfast I make, every hug when you're scared." That night he'd cried in her arms, not because of the hall's cruelty, but because her love was a weight he felt unworthy of carrying. In the atrium, the president's voice crackled through the microphone, pulling Mason back. "We're here to celebrate not just knowledge, but the people who make it possible," he began, his tone hinting at something momentous. Mason glanced at Clara, whose eyes were fixed on the stage, her bracelet catching the light. He thought of the scholarship he'd won, the one that had brought him to Brighton. The halls had bragged about their influence, but it was Clara who'd driven him to every college tour, who'd proofread his essays until her eyes burned. When he doubted his place among Ivy League hopefuls, she'd said, "You belong anywhere you choose to stand." And stand he did, earning accolades that silenced everyone but his family's whispers. The memory of his first science fair flickered through his mind. He'd been 13, his project a mess of wires and cardboard. The other kids had professional kits, their parents hovering with advice. Mason had Clara, who'd spent her grocery money on batteries and glue. When he didn't place, she'd hugged him and said, "Winning's not the prize, Mason. Trying is." That night, she baked his favorite cookies, the kitchen smelling of warmth and hope. It was her way of saying failure wasn't the end, only a step. Now, as the president paused, the crowd leaned forward, sensing a revelation. Mason's heart raced, though he didn't know why. Clara's presence beside him was a steady pulse, grounding him. He thought of the countless mornings she'd woken early to braid his hair when he was young, teaching him pride in his heritage despite the hall's sneers. "You're Asian, like me," she'd said once, her voice gentle but firm. "And that's a strength, no matter what they say." Her words had built him, piece by piece, into the man who stood here now, ready to be honored. The hall's whispers had quieted, but their eyes still lingered on Clara, their judgment a heavy cloud. Mason wanted to shield her, to make them see her as he did, a woman who'd chosen him when no one else would. He remembered the night his mother died, the hall's cold dismissal, and Clara's quiet offer to take him in. She'd had no obligation, no wealth, just a heart wide enough to hold a grieving boy. That choice, made without fanfare, had changed everything. As the president cleared his throat, hinting at a special award, Mason felt a spark of something. Hope, maybe, or intuition. Clara's hand rested lightly on his arm, her warmth a reminder of every sacrifice, every late night, every unspoken "I love you." The halls could mock her dress, her past, her skin, but they couldn't touch what she'd built in him. She was his mother, not by blood, but by every choice that mattered. And as the room held its breath, Mason sensed that the world was about to see her light. A brilliance no whisper could dim. The library atrium at Brighton University shimmered with the clink of glasses and the hum of self-congratulation. The celebration of the new library's opening was now spilling into a lavish reception. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms across the polished oak tables, where guests savored delicate canapés and sparkling cider. Mason Hall, his heart still buoyed by pride in Clara Nguyen, his adoptive mother, guided her through the crowd. Her simple navy dress stood out like a quiet hymn among the symphony of tailored suits and silk gowns. The Halls, Mason's grandmother, Judith, and aunt, Deborah, held court near a towering floral arrangement, their laughter sharp and performative. But beneath the festive veneer, a storm was brewing, one that would test the bonds of love and loyalty in a single shattering moment. Clara's hand rested lightly on Mason's arm, her silver bracelet catching the light as they moved toward a table laden with desserts. Her presence was a quiet anchor, her dark eyes scanning the room with the calm of someone who'd weathered worse than whispers. Mason, still glowing from the president's earlier praise of his work, felt a surge of defiance. The hall's earlier jabs, "She looks like she's here to scrub the floors," still burned in his chest, but Clara's steady gaze kept him grounded. He wanted this night to be perfect for her, a chance to share in his triumph, to stand tall in a room that had tried to diminish her. The crowd parted as they reached the dessert table, where delicate pastries and chocolate-dipped strawberries gleamed under soft lighting. A few professors nodded at Mason, their smiles warm but fleeting, as they glanced at Clara. She offered a polite nod in return, her composure unshaken, though Mason noticed the slight tightening of her fingers on his arm. He knew she heard the murmurs, the way eyes lingered too long on her worn dress, the way Deborah's voice carried just enough to wound. He leaned closer, whispering, "You look beautiful, Mom." Clara's smile was a flicker of sunlight, but before she could respond, a voice sliced through the air, sharp and deliberate. "If your real mother were alive, she'd be so disappointed to see you with her." Deborah's words, slurred slightly from too much champagne, landed like a blade. The room seemed to freeze, the hum of conversation stuttering into silence. Heads turned, eyes wide with shock or curiosity, as Deborah stood, swaying slightly, her glass tilted, her smirk unapologetic. Judith beside her stiffened but didn't intervene, her lips pursed in a thin line of complicity. The words hung heavy, a public execution of Clara's place in Mason's life, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. Mason's breath caught, his face flushing with a rage so raw it made his hands tremble. He stepped forward, his voice rising before he could stop it. "How dare you?" he began, but Clara's hand, gentle yet firm, closed around his wrist. "Mason," she said softly, her voice a lifeline pulling him back from the edge. "It's okay. We know who we are." Her eyes, steady and warm, locked onto his, and in them, he saw a strength that made his anger feel small. The room was still watching, some guests averting their gazes, others whispering behind their hands. But Clara stood unshaken, her dignity a shield no insult could pierce. Mason's heart pounded, his mind racing with memories of Clara's unwavering presence. When he was 7, crying in the dark after a nightmare, it was Clara who sat by his bed, humming softly until he slept. When the halls ignored his school plays, it was Clara in the back row, clapping louder than anyone. And when his biological mother's absence left a void, it was Clara who filled it. Not with words, but with actions. Lunches packed, shoes polished, dreams nurtured. Deborah's words weren't just an attack on Clara. They were an assault on the woman who'd raised him when no one else would. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until a professor nearby cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Conversation resumed, but it was strained, the air thick with unease. Mason's eyes burned, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to make Deborah choke on her cruelty, but Clara's touch kept him rooted. She picked up a strawberry, her movements deliberate, and took a small bite, as if the world hadn't just tried to tear her down. "Let's sit," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced Mason's protest. He followed her to a table near the edge of the room, his anger simmering but held in check by her quiet command. As they sat, Mason's mind churned with the injustice of it all. He remembered the first time he'd called Clara Mom, at 10 after she'd bandaged his knee from a fall. The halls had scoffed, saying she was just the help, but Clara had smiled, her eyes glistening, and said, "You can call me whatever feels right." That word Mom had become their truth, a bond forged in late-night study sessions and quiet moments of trust. Deborah's words couldn't erase that, but they cut deep, exposing the raw edge of Mason's loyalty. The crowd's attention shifted as a string quartet began to play, their notes weaving through the tension like a fragile thread. Mason glanced at Clara, who was watching the musicians, her face serene but her fingers tracing the edge of her bracelet, a nervous habit he knew well. He wanted to apologize, to shield her from the hall's venom, but he knew she'd wave it off. She always did. Instead, he reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm proud you're here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara's smile was soft, but her eyes held a fire that said she'd never let the halls break her. Across the room, Deborah and Judith whispered again, their heads bent together, But their voices were lower now, cautious. Mason caught fragments, didn't expect him to react like that, and felt a flicker of satisfaction. They hadn't anticipated his defiance, his unwavering loyalty to Clara. But the sting of Deborah's words lingered, a wound that wouldn't close easily. He thought of the years Clara had endured their scorn, the way she'd walked into their world of wealth and judgment with nothing but love for him. She'd never asked for their approval, never needed it. But Mason burned with the need to make them see her worth. The president's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing the next part of the evening. A special recognition to come. Mason's heart quickened, sensing a shift in the night's rhythm. He looked at Clara, who was watching the stage, her expression unreadable but alert. The hall's cruelty had drawn a line, but something in the air, a whisper of something greater, promised to cross it. Mason tightened his grip on Clara's hand, feeling the weight of her sacrifices, her love, her unyielding strength. Whatever came next, he knew they'd face it together, as they always had, with a bond no words could break. The library atrium at Brighton University pulsed with a restless energy, the reception's earlier tension still lingering like a shadow over the polished floors. The string quartet's final notes faded, and the crowd's chatter softened as the university president, Dr. Harold Grayson, stepped onto the stage, his silver hair catching the chandelier's glow. Mason Hall sat beside Clara Nguyen, his adoptive mother, their hands still clasped after Deborah's vicious words. "If your real mother were alive, she'd be so disappointed to see you with her." The sting of that insult burned in Mason's chest, but Clara's calm, unyielding presence kept him anchored. Her simple navy dress and silver bracelet stood in quiet defiance of the hall's scorn, her dark eyes fixed on the stage with a steadiness that belied the cruelty she'd endured. As Dr. Grayson adjusted the microphone, a hush fell over the room, and Mason felt a prickle of anticipation, as if the air itself held a secret about to break. Dr. Grayson's voice, warm and resonant, filled the atrium. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our new library, but the people who make our community extraordinary." He began, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. The Halls, Mason's grandmother, Judith, and Aunt Deborah, sat near the front, their postures rigid, their champagne flutes untouched since their public outburst. Mason's eyes flicked toward them, their earlier smugness replaced by a cautious unease. He squeezed Clara's hand, her warmth a reminder of every sacrifice she'd made, every late-night study session, every patched-up school uniform, every moment she'd chosen him when no one else would. The president's tone shifted, growing solemn. "But before we honor our scholars, there's a special recognition, one we've kept under wraps until this moment." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turning, eyes curious. Mason's heart quickened, though he couldn't say why. Clara's fingers stilled on her bracelet, her gaze sharpening as if she sensed something coming. Dr. Grayson's smile widened, but his voice carried a weight that silenced the room. 15 years ago, a tragedy struck our campus," he said, pausing for effect. "A student, critically injured in a car accident, faced certain death. But one woman, with no ties to this university, stepped forward. She donated a part of her liver, an act of selfless courage, and then vanished, asking for no thanks, no recognition." The atrium was still. The clink of glasses and rustle of programs were gone, silent. Mason's breath caught, a memory stirring, a vague news story from his childhood, whispers of a campus angel who'd saved a life and slipped away. He glanced at Clara, whose expression remained unreadable, though her eyes glistened faintly under the lights. The halls shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier mockery, "She looks like she's here to scrub the floors," now a distant echo in the face of this revelation. Dr. Grayson's voice rose, filled with reverence. "Through years of quiet investigation, we traced the anonymous donor, and tonight, we honor her with the Heart of Humanity Award." A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by a swell of whispers. Mason's pulse raced, his mind struggling to connect the dots. Dr. Grayson paused, letting the moment settle, then spoke the name that changed everything. "Clara Nguyen." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the atrium. Mason's mouth fell open, his eyes darting to Clara, her hand tightened around his, her face a mask of shock, her lips parting as if the sound of her own name felt foreign. The halls froze, their faces a spectrum of disbelief. Deborah's glass slipped slightly in her hand, Judith's pearls suddenly seemed too tight around her neck. Mason turned to Clara, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, you did that?" Her glistening eyes met his, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. "For someone like you, Mason," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "For anyone who needed a chance." The room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that rose from students, faculty, and strangers alike. Mason stood, his hands clapping before he realized it, his chest tight with a pride so fierce it threatened to spill over. Clara, still seated, looked stunned, as if the weight of the moment hadn't fully settled. The Halls remained seated, their earlier venom replaced by a stunned silence. Deborah's smirk was gone, her eyes wide with something like shame. Judith's hands fidgeted in her lap, her composure cracking like thin ice. The crowd's applause grew louder, and Mason stepped into the aisle, gesturing for Clara to rise. She did, slowly, her movements graceful but heavy with disbelief. As she walked toward the stage, her navy dress seemed to transform under the spotlight, no longer just fabric but a mantle of dignity. The room watched, some with tears, others with awe, as the woman they'd dismissed as the help became the hero. Of the night, Dr. Grayson met Clara at the stage's edge, his hand extended, his eyes shining with respect. "Miss Nguyen," he said into the microphone, "your selflessness has inspired us all." He handed her a glass plaque, its inscription glinting under the lights. Clara took it, her hands trembling slightly, and faced the crowd. The applause softened, waiting for her to speak. Mason, standing below, felt his heart swell, his earlier anger at the Halls replaced by an overwhelming need to see Clara shine. She cleared her throat, her voice soft but clear. "I never thought this day would come," she began, her words carrying a quiet power. 15 years ago, I saw life hanging in the balance, and I did what felt right, not for praise, but because someone needed help." She paused, her eyes finding Mason's in the crowd. "I didn't raise Mason to be my son by blood, but by choice. Every breakfast I made, every night I stayed up with him, every tear I dried, that's what made me his mother, and that's enough for me." The room was silent, her words sinking deep, stirring sniffles and nods. Mason's eyes burned as his hands clapped again, louder this time, as the crowd joined in, the sound swelling into a roar. Even a few professors wiped their eyes and students whispered in awe. The Halls, still seated, looked small now, their earlier arrogance dwarfed by Clara's truth. Mason's pride surged, not just for her heroism, but for the woman who'd chosen him day after day against all odds. As Clara stepped down, the applause followed her, a tide of recognition that drowned out the Hall's whispers. Mason met her at the stage's edge, his arms wrapping around her in a hug that said everything he couldn't. The room felt different now, as if Clara's light had shifted its very foundation. The Hall's cruelty had been exposed, and though they sat in silence, Mason knew the night wasn't over. Something bigger was coming. A reckoning that would leave no doubt about Clara's place, not just in his life, but in the world's eyes. The atrium of Brighton University's new library glowed under the chandelier's golden light, but the air had shifted, charged with awe and reverence. After the president's revelation, Clara Nguyen, Mason Hall's adoptive mother, stood on the stage, clutching the Heart of Humanity Award, her navy dress catching the spotlight as if it had been woven for this moment. Moments ago, Dr. Grayson had unveiled her heroic act, donating part of her liver to save a student 15 years prior, then vanishing without a word of thanks. The crowd's applause still echoed, a thunderous wave that drowned out the earlier venom of the Halls, Mason's biological family, whose cruel whispers, "She looks like she's here to scrub the floors," now seemed like ash in the wind. Mason, standing below, his heart pounding with pride, watched Clara, his mother in every way that mattered, prepared to speak. The room held its breath, and he knew her words would redefine everything. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the glass plaque, its inscription glinting like a promise kept. Her dark eyes scanned the sea of faces, students, faculty, strangers, and the Halls whose smugness had crumbled into stunned silence. Deborah, Mason's aunt, sat with her champagne glass forgotten, her lips parted in disbelief. Judith, his grandmother, clutched her pearls, her face a mask of unease. Clara's presence, once dismissed as insignificant, now commanded the room, her quiet strength a force no one could ignore. Mason's chest swelled, his earlier rage at Deborah's cruel remark, "If your real mother were alive, she'd be so disappointed," replaced by a fierce, unshakable pride. He nodded at Clara, a silent urging to claim this moment, to let the world see her as he always had. She cleared her throat, her voice soft but carrying a clarity that silenced the last whispers. "I'm not used to standing in front of crowds," she began. A small, self-conscious smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought I'd be here, holding this." She lifted the plaque, slightly tracing its edge. 15 years ago, I didn't think about being a hero. I saw a young person fighting for life, and I thought, if I can help, I will. That's all it was. Not for medals, not for applause, just because it was right. Her words landed like gentle rain, soaking into the hearts of the listeners who leaned forward, captivated. Mason's eyes burned, memories flooding back. Clara at 6, tucking him into bed after his mother's death when the Halls left him to grieve alone. Clara at 10, teaching him to read despite her own long shifts cleaning houses. Clara at 16, cheering at his debate tournaments when no one else showed up. She'd never asked for recognition, never needed it. Yet here she was, her quiet heroism laid bare for all to see. The crowd's silence was reverent, broken only by soft sniffles and the faint click of a camera capturing the moment. Clara's gaze found Mason's, and her voice softened, trembling with emotion. "I didn't give birth to Mason," she said, each word deliberate, "but I chose him. Every morning I made his breakfast. Every night I listened to his fears. Every time he fell, I helped him stand. That's what makes me his mother. Not blood, but love." A lump rose in Mason's throat, his hands clapping instinctively, the sound sharp in the stillness. Others joined, the applause swelling like a tide, washing over the Halls, who sat motionless, their earlier arrogance now a distant memory. She paused, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "I don't need a title to love him. I don't need anyone's permission. I did what I did because Mason gave my life meaning, just as that student I helped years ago gave me purpose." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound, and Mason felt them pierce his heart. He thought of the countless times she'd sacrificed, skipping meals to buy his school supplies, walking miles to save bus fare, staying up to mend his clothes. The Halls had called her the help, but she was his everything. The applause grew louder. Students and faculty rising to their feet, their faces a mix of awe and shame. A professor near Mason wiped his eyes, whispering, "She's incredible." A student snapped a photo, her expression one of quiet reverence. The Halls, however, remained seated, their faces pale, their earlier cruelty exposed like a wound under the spotlight. Deborah's hands fidgeted, her earlier smirk replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. Judith's gaze dropped to her lap, as if she could no longer bear to meet Clara's eyes. Clara stepped back from the microphone, the plaque held close, and Dr. Grayson took her hand, his voice warm as he addressed the crowd. "Miss Nguyen is a testament to what makes this university and this world better. Her selflessness, her quiet strength inspires us all." He gestured for her to stay, but Clara shook her head gently, her humility as powerful as her words. She descended the stage, her steps steady, her navy dress catching the light like a beacon. Mason met her at the bottom, his arms wrapping around her in a hug that felt like coming home. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice thick. "I'm so proud of you." Clara's smile was soft, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I didn't do it for pride, Mason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did it for love." The crowd's applause followed them, a wave of sound that seemed to lift them above the Hall's judgment. Mason glanced back at his family, their faces a study in discomfort. Deborah's glass now set aside, Judith's hands clasped tightly. They hadn't just been wrong. They'd been blind, unable to see the woman who'd shaped Mason's life with more care than they had ever offered. As they returned to their table, the room felt transformed, the air lighter, as if Clara's truth had cleansed it. Guests approached, offering quiet congratulations, their earlier indifference replaced by respect. A young student, barely older than Mason, shook Clara's hand, her voice trembling. "You're amazing," she said, and Clara nodded, her humility unwavering. Mason watched, his heart full, knowing this moment was only the beginning. The Hall's whispers had been silenced, but their reckoning wasn't over. Clara's light, once hidden, now shone too brightly to ignore, and Mason sensed the night held more to reveal. a final truth that would cement her place not just in his heart, but in the world's memory. The atrium of Brighton University's new library stood hushed, the weight of Clara Nguyen's moment on stage still reverberating through the crowd. The chandelier's golden light bathed the room, but the air felt raw, stripped of pretense after Clara's speech and the revelation of her heroism, donating part of her liver to save a stranger 15 years ago. Mason Hall stood by her side, his heart swollen with pride, his hand clasped around hers as they returned to their table. Her navy dress, once mocked by the halls as fit for scrubbing floors, now seemed a banner of quiet triumph, her silver bracelet glinting like a badge of honor. The applause had faded, but its echo lingered, a testament to Clara's unyielding light. Yet across the room, Mason's biological family, his grandmother Judith and Aunt Deborah, sat in brittle silence, their earlier venom. If your real mother were alive, she'd be so disappointed, exposed as hollow in the face of Clara's truth. The crowd stirred, resuming their conversations, but the mood was altered, as if Clara's words had cracked a fault line through the room's polished facade. Guests cast furtive glances at her, some with admiration, others with unease, as if re-evaluating their own assumptions. Mason's eyes burned with a mix of elation and lingering anger. He wanted to shield Clara from the hall's cruelty, to make them choke on their smugness. But her calm presence, her hand steady in his, reminded him that she'd never needed their validation. She'd raised him, loved him, chosen him, and now the world saw her for who she was. But the hall's silence was deafening. Their faces pale, their champagne flutes abandoned on the table like relics of a fallen dynasty. As Mason and Clara settled at their table, a young professor approached, his voice low with respect. "Miss Nguyen, your story, it's humbling," he said, shaking her hand. Clara nodded, her smile gentle but guarded, as if she sensed the room's eyes still on her. Mason watched, his chest tight, remembering the years she'd endured the hall's disdain, calling her the help, dismissing her as unworthy. Yet she'd never faltered, never let their poison dim her love. He thought of the nights she'd stayed up, mending his clothes with calloused hands, or the mornings she'd packed his lunches with notes that read, "You're enough, Mason." Those moments, small and unseen, had built him, and now her heroism was undeniable. The string quartet resumed its notes, soft but unable to mask the tension at the hall's table. Deborah's earlier smirk was gone. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers twisting the stem of her glass. Judith, her pearls gleaming coldly, stared at her plate, her composure fraying like threadbare silk. Mason caught their glances, fleeting and uneasy, as if they were grappling with the weight of their misjudgment. The room's energy shifted again when Judith stood, her movement stiff, and made her way toward Clara. The crowd parted slightly, sensing a confrontation, and Mason's pulse quickened, his protective instinct flaring. Judith stopped before their table, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes avoiding Clara's. "I didn't know," she said, her voice low and halting, each word dragged out like a confession. The admission hung in the air, fragile and insufficient. Mason's jaw clenched, his mind flashing to years of her cold dismissal, refusing to acknowledge Clara at his school events, whispering about her place behind closed doors. Clara looked up, her expression calm but piercing, her dark eyes holding Judith's without flinching. "You never asked," she replied, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the pretense with surgical precision. The words landed like a quiet thunderbolt, and Judith flinched, her cheeks flushing. The crowd nearby fell silent, their attention drawn to the exchange. Deborah, still seated, shifted uncomfortably, her earlier bravado replaced by nervous fidgeting. Mason felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by Clara's steady gaze, which held no malice, only truth. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand respect. Her presence, her life, her choices spoke louder than any outburst could. Mason wanted to stand, to call out Judith's hypocrisy, but Clara's hand on his arm stopped him, her touch a reminder that this moment wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. A younger cousin, Peter, approached next, his face flushed with embarrassment. He'd laughed earlier when Deborah mocked Clara's dress, but now his eyes were fixed on the floor. "I didn't realize what you did," he mumbled, barely audible. Clara's smile was kind but unyielding. "You didn't need to," she said simply, her voice carrying a weight that made him swallow hard. Peter nodded, A single jerky motion and retreated, his shoulders slumped. The exchange was brief, but it shifted the room's dynamic, the halls in our arrogance crumbling under the weight of Clara's dignity. Mason's heart ached, not for his family's shame, but for the years Clara had endured their cruelty in silence. He remembered the time she'd walked him to a parent-teacher conference, her shoes worn thin, only to hear Judith whisper, "Why does she bother?" Clara had never responded, never let their words break her. Instead, she'd sat with him, praising his progress, her pride a shield against their disdain. Now, as the room watched, Mason saw her strength anew. A woman who'd chosen love over bitterness, who'd raised him with a heart bigger than any wealth the halls could claim. Guests began to approach, offering quiet words of admiration. A student, her eyes bright with tears, clasped Clara's hand. "You're an inspiration," she said, and Clara nodded, her humility unshaken. Mason watched, his pride swelling, but his gaze kept drifting to the halls. They were whispering again, their voices low, their faces tight with something like regret. But Clara didn't look their way. She didn't need their apologies, their approval, or their guilt. Her reward was in Mason's hand and hers, in the life they'd built together, in the moment on stage when the world finally saw her light. As the reception continued, the quartet's music swelling, Mason leaned close to Clara. "You didn't have to forgive them," he whispered, his voice thick. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I didn't," she said softly. "I just chose not to carry their weight." Her words settled over him, a lesson in grace he'd carry forever. The hall's apologies, half-hearted and late, couldn't undo years of prejudice, but they marked a turning point. The room, once divided by their whispers, now buzzed with respect for Clara. Mason felt the night's momentum building, a sense that this wasn't the end, that Clara's story and his love for her would resonate far beyond this moment, leaving a legacy no one could ignore. The Brighton University Library atrium, its chandeliers dimming as the reception drew to a close, seemed to exhale, the weight of Clara Nguyen's triumph settling like dust after a storm. The air, once sharp with the hall's cutting whispers, "She looks like she's here to scrub the floors. If your real mother were alive, she'd be so disappointed," now carried a quiet reverence, transformed by the revelation of Clara's heroism. 15 years ago, she had donated part of her liver to save a stranger, asking for nothing in return. And tonight, the Heart of Humanity Award had crowned her courage. Mason Hall, his heart ablaze with pride, stood beside his adoptive mother. Her navy dress glowed under the fading light, the glass plaque in her hands, a symbol of a truth the halls could no longer deny. As they stepped into the cool night, Mason felt this wasn't just an ending, but a consecration, a moment that would etch Clara's legacy into the world. The campus was quiet now, the jasmine-scented breeze weaving through the trees, the stars above glinting like witnesses to the night's transformation. Clara walked beside Mason, her steps steady, the plaque tucked under her arm, its weight a tangible echo of her selflessness. Her silver bracelet caught the moonlight, a small reminder of the boy who'd given it to her years ago, when he was just a child she had chosen to love. Mason's throat tightened, memories of her sacrifices flooding back. Nights spent mending his clothes, mornings packing lunches with handwritten notes, moments of unwavering presence when the halls offered only indifference. Their apologies, Judith's faltering, "I didn't know," Peter's mumbled, "I didn't realize," had been too little too late, crumbling against Clara's unyielding dignity. They reached their modest apartment, the familiar creak of the door, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the evening. Inside, the living room was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, its light pooling on the wooden floor, mingling with the faint scent of lavender from Clara's favorite candles. A half-eaten chocolate cake sat on the kitchen counter, a tradition for every milestone, from Mason's first spelling bee to his university acceptance. Clara set the plaque on the table, her fingers lingering on its smooth surface, her eyes distant yet warm, as if she were still processing the night's weight. Mason watched her, his heart swelling with a love so deep it felt like it could reshape the world. His gaze drifted to the refrigerator where an old photograph had hung for years, a snapshot of him and Clara in their tiny kitchen taken when he was 10. His gap-toothed grin beamed beside her, her work apron dusted with flour, her laughter frozen mid-burst as they flipped pancakes. The photo's edges were curled, its colors faded, but it was a sacred relic capturing the moment. Mom became more than a word. Mason crossed the room, his steps slow, reverent, and gently removed the photo, his fingers brushing its worn surface. Clara turned, her brow lifting in curiosity as he reached into a drawer for a new frame. One he'd bought on instinct, as if he'd known this night would demand it. Inside the frame was a photograph from the evening, captured by a student's camera. Clara on stage, the spotlight illuminating her navy dress, the plaque gleaming in her hands, her face radiant with humility and strength. Mason's breath hitched, the image a testament to her heroism, not just in the act of saving a life, but in every quiet choice to raise him, to love him, to stand by him against the hall's scorn. He tucked the old photo into a memory box, its place in their story secure, and hung the new one on the refrigerator door, its position deliberate, a quiet coronation. Below it, he taped a note in his careful handwriting. "You wrote my dreams with the things." No one else saw Clara's eyes glisten as she read the words, her hand rising to her mouth. "Mason," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you didn't have to do that." He stepped closer, his own eyes burning. "I did," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "The world needs to see what I've always seen." He thought of the hall's cruelty, their refusal to acknowledge Clara's role in his life, their whispers that she was just the help. This photograph, this moment, was his answer. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove her right, to honor the woman who'd built him with love when their wealth offered only judgment. They sank onto the worn couch, the silence between them warm, filled with the weight of shared years. Mason's mind wandered to the countless moments that had defined their bond. Clara braiding his hair before school, teaching him pride in his heritage despite the hall's sneers. Her laughter during their late-night talks. Her voice steady through his teenage doubts. He remembered the day he'd won his scholarship, how she'd hugged him, her eyes shining, saying, "You belong anywhere you choose to stand." That belief had carried him to Brighton, to this night where her light had finally been seen. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with ordinary sounds, children playing, a car's soft rumble, a dog barking at the moon. But inside, something extraordinary had taken root. Mason thought of the hall's faces, their arrogance shattered by Clara's truth, their apologies too small to mend the years of their prejudice. He didn't care if they changed. What mattered was this moment, this photograph, this woman who'd chosen him when no one else would. Clara reached for his hand, her touch as grounding as ever. "I never needed a stage," she said softly, her eyes on the new photograph. "You are my reason, Mason. Always." He nodded, his throat too tight for words, and pulled her into a hug, the embrace a vow that needed no voice. The photograph on the refrigerator stood as a beacon, not just of Clara's past heroism, but of a love that had weathered every storm. The hall's whispers, their half-hearted remorse, faded into nothingness. This was their truth, a bond forged in quiet sacrifices, now illuminated for all to see. As they sat together, the world outside spinning in its quiet rhythm, Mason knew Clara's legacy would endure. A light no prejudice could dim, a story written in love and forever captured in that single radiant frame. As Clara and Mason's story comes to a close, we're left with a powerful reminder. True heroism shines in the quiet choices made every day, not just in moments of glory. What did this tale of love and resilience stir in you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how Clara's journey touched your heart or challenged your perspective. Drop a note about where you're watching from too. Let's connect across the miles. Thank you for joining us in this unforgettable story of a mother's unbreakable spirit. Your support keeps these tales alive, so hit that subscribe button to catch our next video. Until then, keep celebrating the unsung heroes in your own life. We'll see you soon with another story that inspires, uplifts, and reminds us what it means to truly live.